Good evening. I'm Thea Keith-Lucas. I'm the coordinator of the Technology and Culture Forum, which is a partnership between the Episcopal Church and MIT based in our shared concern for peace, justice, and a better world. A partnership that began 50 years ago in conversations between the Episcopal chaplain and MIT faculty in their concern about the proliferation of nuclear technology. We are very pleased to welcome all of you, and particularly to have this partnership with Massachusetts Peace Action. We're really glad that you're here. I'd like to invite Marina Robinson, who is a PhD candidate in nuclear engineering and the president of the MIT chapter of Global Zero, to just say a few words about our shared work here on campus, and then we'll begin this important event. Thank you,
Marina. Good evening, everyone. Like Thea said, my name is Marina Robinson, and I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the Nuclear Science and Engineering Department. I'm also the 2014-2015 president of Global Zero here at MIT, which is a student-led organization that really has the mission of bringing together students, faculty, and staff to come up with strategies to achieving complete nuclear disarmament. This is the mission behind Global Zero, which is a campaign that was established in 2008 with 300 worldwide leaders that are all dedicated to this mission. We've had a couple of exciting events since we've been established here at MIT 2 years ago, particularly one last week where we had our opening kind of info session. It was well attended, and we had a very exciting Q&A session. Tomorrow, I wanted to bring you all's attention to another exciting event we have with a nuclear security policy expert named Keir Lieber from Georgetown University. And he's coming to give us a lecture called Why Nuclear Weapons Still Matter, Conventional War and Nuclear Escalation. And it's an interesting kind of controversial perspective where he tries to debunk the conventional wisdom that no sovereign nation would ever rationally use a nuclear weapon in the future. He's trying to present some tangible evidence to say that we need to consider nuclear weapons in the way that we do conventional war and put some of the ownership on the people who are in the conventional sphere. So it's definitely going to be something to provoke questions, and we would love to have you all come and attend. More than welcome. We think this is going to be a team effort to trying to achieve these types of things, and we definitely have to look at it from all the different perspectives. And we're very happy to have Mass Peace Action here this evening. And on that note, I'll turn it off to Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina. Thank you very much, Thea. And I want to also thank Patricia Weinman from the Technology and Culture Forum, because she helped us to find a place and to arrange this meeting. She didn't bring us a lot of students, but that's up to us to do. So we have to do that ourselves. But yeah, we will work on that. That's our next challenge. So the program tonight is, I should tell you just a little bit about Peace Action. We are a grassroots organization, a national organization. Massachusetts Peace Action is the affiliate. We have affiliates across the country, and we work on nuclear disarmament, we work against wars, and we work for a peace economy. And so all of these things fit together very tightly in our mind. And this is a very critical year, working up to the 2015 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review at the UN. And we want you to know that there are going to be activities in the spring. There are going to be lots of important things going on all from now until then. We have a sign-up sheet in the back that we're going to pass around, and we hope that you will sign it. We also have some petitions, one for against nuclear weapons. In fact, the point of it is to support the SANE Act. Senator Markey has introduced the SANE Act, which is a sort of a large anti-nuclear weapons act in the Senate, and there is a companion one in the House, and we think that that is an important approach legislatively to reducing our nuclear weapons, which we seem to be modernizing at the moment, and this is an anti-modernization move too. So tonight we're having this program. Actually, could you hear me before? Because you probably can hear me even better now, can you? Thank you. The day for this program was actually supposed to be the 26th, but since one of our speakers had a very important appointment on the 26th with President Rouhani, we changed it to the 30th because he will be able to tell us about that event. And we have Jim Walsh with us here, and Elaine Scarry are speaking, and we're honored to have them to commemorate the day, which September 26th, which was a commemoration that the United Nations just chose as a day they chose last year, and this year was the first year of the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. A day to, we should have one, we should have it every day in the year, but it's important that we at least have it one day in the year from the United Nations. And they chose that day because it was a day that we almost might not have lived through. It was a day when a wise young Russian Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was bunkered near Moscow when he got a warning call that there were bombs, there were nuclear weapons on planes coming towards Moscow. And he thought, this is a mistake. I don't think this is really going to happen. And he decided not to tell the chain of command. So that is, that was the day that the UN chose to commemorate and to make us all recognize how important it is to eliminate nuclear weapons, because it could happen just that way. It could happen a lot of other ways, and you're going to hear about some of them tonight. First of all, our first guest is Jim Walsh, and Jim is a research associate at the MIT Security Studies program. He's an expert on national security focused on nuclear nonproliferation. He's traveled and held discussions with the governments of both Iran and North Korea. His core scholarly interest, these are almost his own words, are in the reasons why states who start down the nuclear path stop and reverse course. 30 countries have done that, 3 times the number that became nuclear weapons state. So Jim will speak to us tonight about nuclear disarmament and the hurdles that we have to get there. And the imminent hurdle is the negotiation that is currently going on with Iran, and that negotiation has a deadline of November 24th, I believe it is. So right now is a very critical period, and particularly because of the UN meetings last week and Rouhani being in this country, and all the other things that are going on in the Middle East. So with that, I won't say anything more. I will let Jim take over, and thank you so much.
So good evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's great to be here. And I want to thank in particular the MIT Technology and Cultural Forum and Mass Peace Action, but also I Love Global Zero too, so I don't want to exclude them. I was thrilled to be able to come here, and let's see if I can work this PowerPoint. I'm not sure if did that work? Yes. And everyone, they put together a great poster. Did you see the poster? I don't know if you saw it, right? With my head and Elaine's head there, and then It's way better than the poster, and you can't quite tell it from the picture, but there is a mushroom cloud in the middle of the text. Can you see it slightly? I consider this a vast improvement over a previous poster that was done for a talk I did at a university that shall remain nameless. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I teach about nuclear weapons in the Security Studies program at MIT, and I have lots of colleagues who are doing that. Over at SSP, we have Stanton Nuclear Fellows, 3 nuclear fellows, pre-doc, a postdoc, and a something else. And we have 3, 4, 5 faculty who are working on this, and our brothers and sisters in nuclear engineering are also doing stuff, so there's a lot going on. As Sheila indicated, my own sort of interest is, in particular, the story of explaining why, rather, how states that start down the path towards nuclear weapons stop and reverse course. And I've spent a lot of time on Iran. I've been to Iran 5 times, and I'm working this issue now for 15 years. And I want to say that I have a deep bias when it comes to the Iranian nuclear negotiations. I want an agreement. I want an agreement purely out of self-interest because I'm tired of working on this issue. After 15 years, I want this done. And then I can enjoy myself or do fun issues. So I've spent about 30 hours, between the time I've spent with President Ahmadinejad and President Rouhani, I've spent about 30 plus hours with them. I saw Rouhani last week in New York for a private dinner. There were 15 of us there, and then a subsequent larger public event, and had the chance to have breakfast with Foreign Minister Zarif, just 5 of us that previous Friday, which is why I wasn't able to be with you on the date that is so important on the elimination, celebration of the elimination of nuclear weapons. But, spent a lot of time. I've known Zarif for 10 years, so we were able to have frank and honest talks, and I can share some of that with you later on. Just to sort of round out, so you know where I'm coming from, I have a couple of projects this year, next couple of years, if people are interested in them. I have a project on the unintended consequences of financial sanctions against North Korea, and a new project in January, again, both supported by the MacArthur Foundation, on laser enrichment, the non-proliferation implications of laser enrichment. But again, first and foremost, I'm a fan of the organizations who are sponsoring this event. So what am I going to do in my time here? I'm going to talk about 3 things. Where have we been? Where are we at? Where are we going? And I'm going to talk about them both in terms of the broader general picture, nuclear disarmament, the nuclear, writ large, and in the particular with respect to Iran. And the 2 are linked. And one affects the other, and the other affects the one. So that's how we're going to organize this 20 minutes that I have. And I'm going to race through this. But I want you to know I wrote this special for you. I was laboring on this today and even editing at the last moment. Okay, so where have we been? Where have we been? And I want to start first with sort of the broader question of nuclear weapons as we understand them. And I want to say there's a surprising history here, and we think about nuclear weapons in very, very different ways than we did in past decades, in the 70s, in the 60s, in the 50s. In the 60s, you could have a woman dressed like this. That is a mushroom cloud, in case any of you missed it. And she could be Miss Atomic Bomb, this is the 50s, 1955. Well, we don't do that anymore. We don't do that for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons we don't do it is that we don't think about nuclear weapons in the same way that we did in the 1950s. And what I want to do now is tell you a brief story about how history worked out differently than we expected. Well, first of all, and I don't expect you to memorize this table, this is the world nuclear weapons arsenals. Where have we been? Well, the U.S. started with 4 nuclear weapons, and in only 5 years, really faster than some of the other nuclear weapon states, we were quickly up to, in red there, 608 nuclear weapons. And then by the time we hit the peak in 1990, go all the way across to the red, we go from 4 to 608, and again, this is globally speaking, to almost 60,000 nuclear weapons. 60,000. But then the numbers started to come down. 59, 34, 26, 17. And when you look at the traditional nuclear weapon states, those are the states in green, right, who were sort of all along. I'm putting the China, Israel, India, and Pakistan, the non-NPT members, off to the side here. But those numbers, especially for the U.S., come down, 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 5,000. Of that 5,000, and there are different counting rules, we're talking about basically 1,500 strategic weapons, down from numbers that were in the tens of thousands. And so true for the other traditional nuclear weapon states. So I think this is good news. I know I'm supposed to get up here and scare you all and say, things are terrible. But you can't make progress unless you actually understand where you've been successful. And so I would call this success. Now, obviously, the numbers for China, Israel, India, Pakistan, not so good. Particularly Pakistan seems to be increasing. Their base is much smaller. We're down to 1,500. They're up to 70, but they're building more. China's building more, and we are coming down. Similarly, when you look at nuclear tests, spike, right? 1965-ish, down, 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 imperceptibly small. It's only North Korea that's carrying the water at the end. So that's success. That's good. That's a good thing. Now, are there dangers? Are there problems? Yes, yes, yes. But we're not going to make any progress unless we understood how we've made progress. So on weapons arsenals and tests, we've had great progress. But then you say to yourself, Jim, what about the spread of nuclear weapons? This is how we think about the spread of nuclear weapons, right? The Nazis have a program, so the U.S. gets a weapon, and when we get a weapon, the Russians get a weapon, and because the Russians get a weapon, the French, and then it's the Chinese, and the Chinese to India, India to Pakistan, and out it goes, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. And that's the total number of nuclear weapon states, right? It's sort of increased, but those of you who are good watchers here notice that line really flattens at the end, because that's not the story. The story is that the rate of proliferation, the rate at which the number of new nuclear weapon states who join the club each year, it has dropped. It peaked in 1970 when we had 3 members of the nuclear weapons club join, China, France, and Israel. And in every succeeding decade, less and less and less and less. That is a good news story. And as I said, as Sheila indicated, there are a lot of countries that wanted nuclear weapons. 3 times the number of countries wanted nuclear weapons, that's say 30, and didn't get them compared with the 10 who did. The countries in purple, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, inherited nuclear assets after the end of the Cold War. So when we look at where we've been, and we look at the big picture, one could arguably or reasonably argue that nonproliferation has been one of the biggest public policy successes in the 20th century. No one expected this. Everyone predicted we would have dozens of nuclear weapon states. We have fewer nuclear weapon states than predicted. Fewer states seek nuclear weapons today, the candidate pool. Fewer seek them today than in any decade in nuclear history. And since the 1990s, more countries have given up nuclear weapons than acquired them. Of the 9 countries that violated their NPT obligations, only 1, North Korea, became a nuclear weapon state. This is really awesome and what no one anticipated. And it's also not the model in our minds. Now, I think this is a reason for celebration. I went on the web. That's the only celebration image I could find that seemed even any good. I had these others. They didn't look very good either, so I stuck with that one because I think it is a cause for success and a cause for celebration. So where have we been with respect to Iran? Let's quickly summarize that. Well, in most of the talks I give, I always quote verbatim, so there's no contention or lack of clarity about the U.S. intelligence estimate of Iran's nuclear intentions and capabilities. So this is the Director of National Intelligence, the top-ranked nuclear official in the United States, who oversees 16 intelligence agencies in the U.S. And what does he say in public at high confidence every year, the last several years about Iran? He says, quote, Iran has the capacity to eventually produce nuclear weapons, making the central issue its political will to do so. We assess Iran as keeping open the option to develop nuclear weapons, should it choose to do so. We do not know, however, if Iran will eventually decide to build nuclear weapons. So Iran had a nuclear weapons program in 1998 to 2003, ended that program in 2003, and now we are at a moment of inflection, a moment of possibility. They have not decided to pursue nuclear weapons. And so there is, this is what the negotiations are all about. So that's sort of the past. Let me quickly also, and we came to that conclusion, we're worried about Iran because of revelations that happened in 2003. Then from 2003 to 2005, we had negotiations. So we had 3 years of negotiations between the EU3 and Iran. And in 2003, 2005, Iran had 164 centrifuges. It had no 20% enriched uranium, no advanced centrifuges, no Fordow enrichment facility, and the Khatami government. Those negotiations collapsed in 2005. So following the collapse of those negotiations, Iran built 20,000 centrifuges, enriched uranium up to 20%, built advanced centrifuges, built the Fordow underground enrichment facility, and elected Ahmadinejad president. So that's the history we've had. Negotiations, possibility for resolution, collapse of negotiations, giant growth in the nuclear program, and a conservative turn in Iranian politics. Then in 2013, President Rouhani, who had been the lead negotiator in 2003, 2005, won election and began to change course, although some of those changes predated him. And then in November of that year, we signed an interim nuclear deal with Iran, where Iran abandoned 20% enrichment, got rid of its stockpile of 20%, agreed to intrusive verification. So that's where we are right now. We have this interim agreement that's temporary and dependent upon arriving at a final and comprehensive agreement. So that's the past. Where were we before in nuclear? Where were we before in Iran? Where are we now? Now, again, these aren't great pictures I searched the web for better pictures. That's Obama, Putin, and Netanyahu. I could have used that picture, and I chose not to. Or I could have used that picture, and I chose not to, so consider yourself lucky. How would I evaluate where we're at now in terms of the broader disarmament agenda? Well, not surprisingly, I think there are areas where we've made progress, where things are sort of stuck in the mud, and other areas where we're moving backwards. So in progress, the U.S. has articulated a policy of a world without nuclear weapons. That's not really been done before. That's sort of important. And the U.S., we've signed that New START agreement with Russia that got the numbers down to 1,500 strategic warheads. The U.S. is ready to go cut another 500, down to 1,000 strategic weapons. The Russians have not taken up that offer. IAEA inspection is stronger than ever before, fabulously improved. The Europeans, with the Scottish vote and some other budget problems, have begun to talk out loud about the future of their nuclear weapons. That's a good thing. We have a lot more attention to the question of material security. What can we do to prevent a terrorist from stealing bomb-grade material? We have a whole new movement in the nuclear weapons world about humanitarian concerns that says the use of any nuclear weapon is automatically a humanitarian disaster and unethical and immoral. And that's something that Mexico has spearheaded, and that's made progress. And it's not nuclear, but I thought the fact that we had a diplomatic deal that took most of the chemical agent out of Syria, that was a win. That's a huge win. Things that aren't going anywhere. U.S.-Russian nuclear cuts. That's dead for now. The NPT regime, highly contested. We'll talk about this later, but the non-aligned movement, the essentially southern states and other states that aren't committed to the U.S. or the Europeans or whatever, they're angry. They don't feel like we've lived up to their side of the bargain. There's just a big dispute there, and that's sort of frozen everything. Test ban hasn't made a lot of progress. We're never going to pass it. Not never. This Senate isn't going to pass a treaty on test ban, so we abide by the treaty, but it hasn't formally been adopted. And the WMD zones, particularly I'm thinking the WMD free zone in the Middle East, is sort of hit some sand, isn't moving very fast. Regress, and I mean this somewhat facetiously. Russia, Pakistan, Russia, Russia, Pakistan, Russia, Russia, China, Israel, something like that. So what do I mean by that? Well, Russia doesn't want to engage in deeper strategic cuts, right? That's why we haven't cut another 500. After the foray and a continuing foray in Ukraine, Russia has said Putin has said we're a strong nuclear power. They've increased the role that nuclear weapons play in Russian doctrine. The fact that they're playing in Ukraine makes it hard to take tactical nuclear weapons out of Europe. They have been a disaster. Putin is a disaster. Except that Pakistan's really bad too. So Pakistan, what would be the nightmare? Oh, let's see. Okay, a country that has nuclear weapons, that has terrorists on its soil, that funds terrorists in the country next to it, that has weak civilian military control, that has lost 3 wars to its nearest neighbor, and is run essentially by the military and the intelligence service. And, bonus, has more than any other country sold nuclear weapons-related technology and knowledge on the black market. So, Pakistan, not good. That's a regress. So, it's a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture. So, in the past, we've made tremendous progress, and there have been problems in the past, but we've made tremendous progress. Today, we are continuing to make some progress in some areas, but other countries are falling from the path, I would say. But I would say as we go forward, one of the places where we have perhaps the best chance of success, bar none, on the agenda, the nuclear agenda, is a deal with Iran. So let me talk about where we're at with Iran. As I said, I attended these events with Iran's negotiating team and have spoken to their American colleagues. So I can do this in question and answer, but here's sort of the list of things that both sides complain about. We complain about the 20% enriched uranium, which was taken care of by the interim agreement. We complain about that underground facility, that we want more inspections and transparency. That's the additional protocol. We worry about a heavy water reactor, blah, 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 blah. And they say we have a right to enrich, and they want their rights preserved. And they hate the banking sanctions and the other sanctions and their isolation. So these are the things that people are talking about in the room. And they've been talking about since the interim agreement. Well, they pretty much resolved all of these. When I talk to the players, they tell me that if it was up to the negotiators in the room, they'd have a deal by now. But what's holding this up is not technical problems, non-proliferation issues. What is holding this up is a political problem in both capitals. But just to be clear, these negotiators have resolved 20% enrichment, have resolved the Fordo underground facility issue. The additional protocol, Iran will ratify it. The Arak reactor, they're going to change the reactor configuration and lower the power. Advanced centrifuges. The two things that remain for things that the U.S. and others are concerned about are their past military activities, which I believe will be resolved. I think that will be resolved as we've resolved it many times before with other countries. Although I don't think we're going to resolve it until there's a big agreement in place. But the one in red is the problem. And what is keeping us, again, not for technical, not for non-proliferation reasons, but for political reasons, from sealing the deal. And that is the size of Iran's enrichment program and its contours. How many centrifuges, how much SWU, that sort of thing. So the issue for the American, and I don't want to, this is a somewhat technical thing, and maybe I should just move on after this. But the issue that is holding up, that has led to the roadblock, is the so-called breakout issue. It's a deeply flawed issue. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now. I'd be happy to rail and rant about it and question and answer. But it's not, if the talks collapse because of that, it will be a terrible shame. But I'm making a strategic choice to cut that slide and to move on. Because it's time to go to, after having talked about where we've been and where we're at, it's time to talk about where we're going. Well, to me, where we're going depends on several questions. Can Obama take yes for an answer? As I've indicated, my personal belief, it's not a belief shared by everyone, but I'm happy to defend it. My belief is there's already a deal on the table, and that is a belief shared by some of the negotiators. So the question is, will anyone have the political wherewithal, the will, to go ahead and do what needs to be done? If there is an agreement, then there will be a congressional debate, even though most of this will be executed through the executive. And the whole congressional debate, I can tell you based on my years of experience, will be, is the agreement perfect enough? And we can talk about whether that's a good standard. I think that's a terrible standard. I think we should look at costs, benefits, and risks, and then compare them against alternatives, rather than debate how many angels are in the head of the pin and whether the agreement is perfect enough. There are very few perfect agreements. That doesn't stop progress. And the opponents will seek to defeat it. That is certainly true, and I can talk about that. They've already tried to defeat the interim agreement. Wouldn't even let that go. They tried to pass a bill that would have scuttled that. But I think the core line is whether Obama takes a deal or not, what is determining this in the last lap, the last 100 yards, is about politics. It's not about nonproliferation. I want to conclude with a couple of slides. What happens if there's no deal? And here I want to return to talking both about Iran and the implications for the broader international nuclear agenda. For Iran, what happens? Well, remember that history slide where I talked about what happened in 2005 when the negotiations collapsed? And they went from 164 to 20,000. Well, that's a preview, but you're starting on a higher base. So I expect Congress will pass sanctions the next day. They'll respond by expanding their nuclear program. We'll have more centrifuges. We'll have the 20% that's now banned will return. We'll have advanced centrifuges, and the Rouhani team will be discredited, or at least politically weakened and on the defensive. And those hawks in Iran who believe that the negotiations were all play, that it's subterfuge, what we're really interested in is regime change, and this is all blather. Well, for their narrative, that outcome will confirm their belief. And I think finally there'll be an increased risk of war because we won't have a constrained Iranian program. Iran's program will expand, and then you'll hear calls for military action. It's sort of ironic that the people who oppose negotiation right now are going to be the very same people that if negotiations fail will say, look, it's an unconstrained program. We need to take military action. When they're the ones who are trying to defeat the constraints. And for the international agenda, it won't be the end of the nonproliferation regime. You know, we're not going to get CTBT, we're not going to get a test ban, we're not going to get just because we have an Iran agreement. So it'll be weakened, it won't be catastrophic, but I think the risk of an Israeli military strike increases. I think Iran's eventual acquisition of a nuclear weapon increases to be out of an agreement rather than in an agreement. Just that increases the odds. And I think it makes a WMD-free zone in the Middle East less likely. The real cost will be we will have had a chance here. 30 years, thousands of centrifuges, a chance to turn this around with an agreement the negotiators can accept. And then not do it. That's an ugly future. And I hope we seize the opportunity and continue the path of success we've had, and that insofar as it's a political matter, not an issue of technology, not an issue of nonproliferation, well, the Massachusetts Peace Action people and the Global Zero people, what determines that is political action. Will the president have the political will to say yes? And then having said yes, how will Congress act? And that depends on political action on people. That depends more. The negotiations have a tiny, tiny little bit. I can have the tiniest little bit of input into that. But the disposition, whether this survives, will depend on you and people like you, whether you win this political battle or not. So that is the future to be continued. Thank you very much.
Really disturbing. I hope there are enough of us, and I hope that we can get, thank you so much.
I'm going to move
It
this.
wasn't all disturbing. It was,
I hope
and
not.
we're going to have a chance to hear a little bit more about it later. But first of all, it's just disturbing to think how critical this moment is. So we have to do everything we can to magnify our voices and get in touch with our members of Congress and work as hard as we can. And I should say that Peace Action is doing that across the country, and we're very happy to have a voice like yours. And we're now going to hear from Elaine Scarry, who teaches at Harvard University, and she is the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and General Theory of Value. Elaine has written a number of books, including The Body in Pain, On Beauty and Being Just, and most recently, The Thermonuclear Monarchy, which is, we have a copy of it. I highly recommend it. It's a challenging book to us. And it's also, her essays are published in many places, in Best American Essays in 2007, 2005, and 1995. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, and she has been a Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin and in the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences in Stanford, and at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. She lectures widely on programs in literature, medicine, and law. And I want to turn this over to Elaine. Thank you. It's going to be good for you. Thank you so much.
I share some of Jim's optimism, but I also share some of the pessimism. And as you probably know, the most recent research on nuclear winter has confirmed that the earlier studies from the 1980s on nuclear winter actually understated the catastrophe to the Earth that would happen if the current arsenal, even this vastly reduced arsenal that we've just celebrated, if the current arsenal were used, scientists publishing in the leading magazines, Nature, Science, Physics Today, say that we will go into a nuclear winter colder than the Ice Age. They also say that even if a tiny percent of the existing nuclear arsenal is used, not 1%, but 1/100th of 1%, if even that tiny amount is used, 44 million people will die within 1 hour, and 1 billion people will die within 1 month. They're imagining even a small exchange of 50 medium-sized nuclear warheads between Pakistan and India. But obviously, this would be true no matter what the geography is. I think that a lot of countries have abstained from getting nuclear weapons, just as Jim says. The whole southern hemisphere is blanketed with nuclear weapons-free zone treaties that are tremendously admirable. Just for example, the one in Africa, the Treaty of Pearl and Daba, discouraged both South Africa and Algeria from getting nuclear weapons when they had aspired to them. And this is true across the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, there are also reasons to be optimistic. For example, in Austria, constitutional provision prohibiting nuclear weapons. In Scotland, as Jim fleetingly mentioned, part of the drive for that separation was the strong belief of many people in Scotland that UK's nuclear submarines had to be gotten out of Scotland and that they were going to write a constitutional provision making them illegal. So there's lots of reasons to be optimistic, but not all countries have acted so honorably, and I want to talk about one that hasn't, and that's the United States. The United States has by far the most powerful nuclear arsenal on Earth. Many people in the United States believe that these nuclear weapons are a holdover from the Cold War. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have, for example, 14 Ohio-class submarines. Those Ohio-class submarines each carry the equivalent of 4,000 Hiroshima blasts. Those Ohio-class submarines are not sitting in the ports of Kings Bay, Georgia, and Bangor, Washington, looking at movies about the Cold War. They are patrolling the oceans day and night while we go to school, while we go to classes, while we walk the streets. They are on alert. And the number 14 might disguise another very important fact, which is that 8 of those 14 were made after the opening of the Berlin Wall. They are the USS West Virginia, the USS Kentucky, the USS Nebraska, the USS Rhode Island, the USS Maine, USS Wyoming, USS Louisiana. Those 8 ships together carry the equivalent of 32,000 Hiroshima blasts. If I focus on and I should say, and again, this is something that was mentioned very quickly, the previous president, George W. Bush, arranged for 12 new Ohio-class submarines to be designed and constructed, with the first due to arrive in 2021 and the last to arrive in 2035, and President Obama has not done anything to intrude on that plan. I talk about the nuclear submarines because those who have looked at the problem of first use of nuclear weapons perceive that the place where it's most likely to start is at sea. If I were instead to have chosen my subject on the basis of the greatest blast power, I would have not taken the submarines, because the ICBMs and the air delivery systems, the B-2s and the B-52s, have a higher blast level than the submarines. Now, the effect of this architecture, the architecture exists in order to eliminate people. It has no other function than to kill people. That isn't a side effect of the nuclear arsenal. That is what it is designed to do. Each of those submarines can destroy an entire continent. The Earth has 7 continents. We have 14 Ohio-class submarines. Once you eliminate, and given that kind of blast power, I think you can see that the capacity for self-protection is lost. The United States arsenal has eliminated from every country on Earth the capacity for self-defense, and not only from the populations of Earth, but from the capacity for self-defense of all creatures, animals or plants. The possible exception is Switzerland, which has a genius-level fallout shelter system. But that aside, I think it's eliminated the right of self-defense. And what is it that happens when you eliminate the right of self-defense? You also eliminate the voices of the people who might protest that. They are no longer interesting. The big powers are interesting. The distinguished people who control those weapons or negotiate those weapons have voices. But the populations who stand to be injured don't have voices. There'd be many ways to illustrate this, but I find that the quickest shorthand is to repeat and recite the 1995 International Court of Justice case, when 78 countries went to the International Court of Justice and pleaded that nuclear weapons be declared illegal. Article 6, by the way, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty requires nuclear weapons to get rid of, nuclear countries to get rid of their nuclear weapons. But because the nuclear countries weren't doing that, these countries went to the International Court of Justice, pleaded that they be declared illegal. The litigants in the country included, the litigants in the case included Islamic countries such as Qatar. The litigants included India and North Korea, that is, countries that did not at that time have nuclear weapons, but was saying to the court, if you don't start declaring them illegal, we will acquire them. The litigants included Iran. Iran, along with Sweden and Egypt, argued that nuclear weapons violate both the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions, which prohibit disproportionate suffering among people. Among the litigants were others, such as the Marshall Islands, which reminded the court that 67 atomic bombs had been blown up there by the United States. And they argued that nuclear weapons violate the Hague Conventions, which prohibit weapons which indiscriminately pass over the borders of neutral countries. India argued that all rules of proportionality were made absurd by nuclear weapons. Japan, pointing out that it was the one country whose population had been targeted by nuclear weapons, said that nuclear weapons not only violate all these international laws, but violate the very principle of international law that is foundational and underwrites all those laws. Now, the crucial thing to remember, too, is what the United States said. The United States, at that same International Court of Justice meeting, in a joint statement authored by the Department of Defense and the Department of State, argued that having nuclear weapons is not illegal, threatening to use nuclear weapons is not illegal, using nuclear weapons is not illegal, using nuclear weapons first is not illegal. They argued that nuclear weapons in any of those capacities does not violate Geneva, Hague, nor does it violate the Conventions Against Genocide, since even if you kill millions of people, it would only be genocide if you meant to eliminate a specific racial or ethnic group. It argued that it does not violate the Rio and Vienna Conventions on the environment, and it argued that, that the UN had countless times proclaimed that these things were contrary to the UN Charter, but that the UN had no authority to infringe on the power of the United States. So a key thing about this is that it was not reported in newspaper. The case was going on for months. It was a very important case. People all over the world were trying to tell us something. It was not covered in the newspapers. It maybe would be one reference on page 15 somewhere in the midst of the case. We pride ourselves on being a super sentient population with good reason. Most of us can drive cars. I can't, but most of you probably can. Talk on the phone, do 300 emails a day, and yet these outside voices can't be heard. And this problem that you have, on the one hand, a colossal capacity to injure and a tiny capacity to receive information, is paradigmatic of nuclear weapons. I've just described it in terms of the country that has this vast arsenal but can't hear these foreign voices. But I could have described it in terms of the nuclear structure of the weapons themselves. For example, nuclear submarines, of course, have this incredible blast power, and yet when deeply submerged, they have a great deal of difficulty getting information being sent from above ground. Until 2004, this was solved by ELF antennas, extremely low frequency antennas. Those have now been dismantled, and according to the executive at Raytheon, the problem is it takes 24 hours for a message to get reliably under the ocean. Now, there's another change that's come about, as I argue in this book, and that is a momentous change in the nature of government, and that is that with this concentration of military force in the executive branch, we shift into having a monarchy, or what at best would be called a monarchy. And during some presidential administrations, the president has been very overt about that. For example, President Nixon said that we think of the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary as equal branches. He said they're not equal branches because only the executive has a military. This sentiment was echoed recently by former Vice President Cheney, who said the three branches of government are not equal. We've got the helicopters. And you know as well as I do, he was not talking about helicopters. And Nixon also, during the time that he was impeached, being impeached, said, I have the same power as Louis, my power is just as absolute as Louis XIV. The only thing is that it's limited to 4 years at a time. Now, he made statements that we sometimes laugh about, but actually descriptively, what he was saying was simply straightforwardly true. The nuclear football, we know, is never more than a few feet away from the president. whether it's Jimmy Carter going down the river in Idaho on a raft with his family, and another raft is coming right beside him with that black bag, or whether it's President Reagan being taken to the hospital in a motorcade when someone tried to harm him, and in the next car, the black bag is traveling along. So each of our presidents who have served after the invention of atomic weapons has had that same absolute power. We tell ourselves that, of course, an American president would use it. Though we have this huge architecture, it isn't there to be used. That is based on another error, and the error is that we think the model is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is indeed the case that the American public knew that the president was contemplating, with people on the other side of the world, getting us in a nuclear war. But we know that of 10 instances, there are 10 instances when presidents seriously considered using nuclear weapons. So Eisenhower considered using them in the 1954 Taiwan Straits conflict. Eisenhower again contemplated using them in 1959 in Berlin. John Kennedy, 3 times, according to Robert McNamara, came within a hairbreadth of all-out nuclear war. Lyndon Johnson has told us that he contemplated using nuclear weapons against China to prevent China from getting nuclear weapons. Nixon has said that he contemplated using nuclear weapons in 4 instances. Now, here's what's and we know that he actually had planes loaded with nuclear weapons fly over towards Vietnam and in what was intended to be a bluff. Here's what's important about this. Not until 30 or 40 years after each of those events was the public made aware of the fact that this was close. So what kind of close calls will we find out about after Nixon? What kind of close calls will we find out about in the 90s or in the 21st century? Joseph Gearson, who's here with us tonight, points out that at the time of the first Gulf War, there were, is it 1,000 or 10,000 nuclear weapons? 1,000? 1,000 nuclear weapons around Iraq. I will give you another example. On 9/11, you'll recall that President Bush was flying around the country, understandably. There was a reason why it would have been perilous for him to go back to Washington. He stopped at an Air Force base. What Air Force base? Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. What the President mentioned, what not even the 9/11 Commission mentioned, was that Offutt Air Force Base is the nerve center for our nuclear strike force, both against states and against terrorists. I don't even know what it means to say that you have a nuclear strike force against terrorists, since terrorists are usually a small number of people. How could we use a nuclear weapon against 1 million people for actions carried out by a small number of people? Now, what is the solution to this? Obviously, one solution is the international covenants invoked in that International Court of Justice case. I try to show constitutional provisions. One reason why I'm very happy to talk at MIT is because MIT students are so inventive that I can well believe they might come up with some better solution for how to wake up the American public to the moral harm in which we are steeped. But I take this solution, and that is that we have provisions in our Constitution that were we to reanimate them, they've been cast aside, were we to reanimate them, could, along with the international covenants and along with constitutions in other countries, lead our country to obligate ourselves to get rid of them. And by the way, we know that Obama, at the beginning of his administration, expressed the aspiration to get rid of them. Why didn't he get rid of them? There are many reasons, but one reason is he didn't have millions of American citizens coming forward and saying, please do it. Had we done that, I think we'd be much further along at this moment. But here are the constitutional provisions. All constitutions exist primarily to act as a brake on going to war. You can go back and read social contract theory, and you'll see that they came into being primarily, as Thomas Hobbes says, to get us out of the miserable condition of war. And the United States Constitution, like some other constitutions, has two brakes that it puts on a country before it can go to war. Before the executive can take us to war, he has to get the Congress to declare war. And I also argue there's a second provision, which is the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, which distributes to the whole population the obligation to oversee whether we enter war or not, a kind of ratification power over the congressional declaration. Now, since the invention of nuclear weapons, we have not had a single legitimate congressional declaration of war. And this is for good reason. Presidents have felt, I have the power to, in 1 hour, kill 70 million people. That was Nixon's figure. He said, I can go into that room in 25 minutes, pick up the phone, in 25 minutes, 70 million people will be dead. Presidents have that power. Do they really have to go get a permission from Congress just to invade, to drop a few bombs on Iraq or Syria? The elder Bush said, I didn't have to get some old goat's permission in Congress in order to go into Iraq. Because time is short, and because you can read about it in the book, I won't go into great detail, but there I contrast 5 cases where we had an actual declaration of war, and that's the War of 1812, the War of 1846, which is the Mexican-American War, the War of 1898, which is the Spanish-American War, World War I and World War II. And I look at the congressional deliberations and contrast it with the quality of deliberation that you get in a presidential council, and there is no comparison. I'll just give one instance of a different feature. Throughout Congress, you have tremendous testing of the claim that we need to go to war. There are always counter-arguments. We only get to go to war if the people arguing for it can out-argue, can show that the counter-arguments are not right. And I could go into the structure of those arguments, but I'll ask you just to trust me, they're there. Because the people in assembly consider themselves all equal. So they will just talk back. They will test things. In a presidential council, there's a hierarchy. No one will contest anything. I looked at the deliberations of the 1954 Taiwan Straits crisis, and the closest thing there was to a moment of dissent was Secretary of the Treasury Humphrey saying, aren't we going to have a hard time explaining to the American people why we're using an atomic bomb on islands whose names they don't even know? Eisenhower says, a mere look at the maps on the wall will convince you of the strategic importance of these islands. End of conflict. Humphrey doesn't say anything more, nor does anyone else say anything. And in fact, Humphrey had merely read his notes from an earlier meeting. A few months earlier, Eisenhower had said, we might have a hard time convincing the American people that islands with names they don't know could warrant our using an atomic weapon. Humphrey may have thought he was saying something congenial to the president. But the main point I want to make is there's no testing for good reason. The people have been chosen to be on that council because they're on the president's wavelength. But when you're going to go to war and you're going to start injuring people, you want to have people on different wavelengths so that you get some testing of the statements that are made. By 1959, Eisenhower believed that if he were to use an atomic weapon, he could be impeached. He said that several times in 54. By 59, he believes that maybe he can do it, make it legitimate by just having a few congressmen there at the meetings with him, which doesn't at all make it legitimate. But we see a few senators and a few representatives. No dissent with one exception, and the exception is from someone whose name you all know, even those who are in the room who are very young, and that's the name Senator Fulbright. Fulbright says in the midst of this, I just want to make sure I understand what's being said here. Are you saying that East Germany could destroy the roads in West Germany, and that maybe we would have a repairman come in and begin to fix it, and that maybe the GDR soldier would shoot a rifle and then we would drop an atomic bomb? And Eisenhower says, we're not exactly sure of the steps that would lead to an atomic bomb, but one thing's for sure is that once the conflict's underway, there isn't time to go to the UN. That is, he doesn't say, Senator Fulbright, have you lost your mind? Of course we wouldn't use an atomic weapon when a rifle is being shot, et cetera. So there are other features that differentiate them, and there are things for which a presidential council is a perfect deliberative body. But going to war is not one of them, and that's why the Constitution did that. Now, the other provision I look at is the right to bear arms, and I know that in the world we live in today, there are two divided populations. One population embraces the right to bear arms as giving them power for recreation and for protecting themselves against criminals. The other feels tremendous disdain for the right to bear arms, doesn't want to even hear the name of it. But I want to say to you, and I can only claim it without evidence, but I go into great detail in the book, it is a very great amendment, and it is meant to say whether we have a minuscule amount of military power or a huge amount of military power, it has to be equally divided across the whole citizenry. Because that's the way you hold it in a civil frame, is to say each of us has responsibility over a small parcel of it, and only if we all agree will we actually take up arms. And in the world when we had reliance on conventional weapons, soldiers did exercise consent and dissent, and I'd be happy to go into that in much greater detail. Again, how we can bring these constitutional provisions to bear is something that some of you might figure out, and any of us at Global Zero or Peace Action or any of us individually, all our phone numbers are in the phone book, would welcome any suggestion. Or you might have a better suggestion for how to wake up the American citizenry. Gandhi said that you can wake a man who's asleep, but you can't wake a man who's pretending to be asleep. And the great question for all of us concerned about nuclear weapons is the American public asleep, or is the American public just pretending to be asleep? The American public, even those who don't think a lot about nuclear weapons, would probably acknowledge that nuclear weapons are on some level incompatible with governance. In this sense, they're subject to accidents. That means they're ungovernable. They're subject to appropriation by terrorists who can break into one of the facilities. Sister Megan Rice, whose niece is here with us tonight, broke in with two companions, went through 4 perimeter fences at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, risked her life to do that, and showed that certainly there was no security at those places. She's now serving a 3-year sentence for her heroic act. Yeah. So people would acknowledge nuclear weapons are ungovernable in the sense of being prone to accidents, non-governable in the sense that they can be taken up by a rogue state, non-governable in the sense that they can be appropriated by a terrorist, non-governable in the sense that they can be hacked into. And we had, even one of our major nuclear delivery planes was hacked into a few years ago, and that was one of 1,800 hacking incidents the federal government had suffered that year. But what I believe the American public doesn't see is that nuclear weapons are incompatible with governance in a much deeper way. We act as though there might be some legitimate possession of nuclear weapons, but how can an arsenal whose sole function is to massacre people be compatible with governance? Thomas Hobbes said that of all the things that could happen in a country, the worst would be the massacre of a citizenry. And he said, this couldn't happen no matter what form of governance you have, aristocracy, monarchy, democracy, it can't happen. The only way this could happen is if you had moral anarchy, which is something close to what we have. And finally, I would just say that the crucial thing to remember is that only injuries that haven't yet happened can be stopped. We can and should attend to injuries that have happened in our own country and other countries in the past. But we can't change the fact that those happened. We can change the fact that this happened. We can only change it by acting before the fact. And I hope we'll find ways to step forward and act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was powerful, powerful. So I'm sure you have questions. I'm sure that some of you have questions that you want to ask our two wonderful speakers. And I'm not sure where I would start if I had to start right now. Yeah, why don't you both come up here and sit here? That would be ideal. Right, yeah, you take that mic around. Right.
Tell me who you're going to call on first. Hello, I'm Ken Thomas. I'm 59. I live in the community. I live in Somerville. In 1975, I joined the U.S. Navy for its nuclear engineering program. I was a machinist mate in nuke. They operate and maintain the nuclear reactors on submarines, aircraft carriers. 6-year program, 9 months into it, I didn't want to do it, got out. But I've maintained an interest in this, and I'm curious about it and what's going on. More recently, Paul Bracken has written a book titled The Second Nuclear Age. In it, he says that, in his opinion, the second nuclear age started in the 1970s when Israel got nuclear weapons. I was a little bit surprised to discover that Israel collaborated with South Africa in its getting nuclear weapons and its testing them under the apartheid regime that they had in South Africa. And I became curious about the absence of public discussion about that. There was all this outrage in the 70s about apartheid and divesting from South Africa. And while that was going on, Israel was collaborating with South Africa to develop its nuclear weapons and helping apartheid South Africa get its. Mr. Walsh, in your conversation, you talked about Iran and its nuclear weapons, but there's not a lot of public discussion about Israel having nuclear weapons. So these are some of the things I'd like to see if you have some opinions about Israel having nuclear weapons and its relationship with apartheid South Africa, why there is so little public conversation about these things.
It's a great question. We have someone in the audience, Marvin Miller, who's an expert on Israeli nuclear weapons, but I'll simply say that it's true that it doesn't get talked about at all. It doesn't get talked about at all here. Sometimes within an NPT, within a non-proliferation treaty context, the Arab states have made this an issue, which is why there's been move in recent years, since 1995, to try to push for a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. It's pretty much an Egyptian initiative aimed at trying to get at the Israeli nuclear issue. But yeah, we talk about, in the U.S. domestic political scene, no one wants to talk about it. And for my friends who work on the Israeli side, no one wants to talk about it in Israel. And so it's hard to address something that no one wants to talk about. So I think that's a real problem, absolutely. It seems to me that those nuclear weapons are no more or less legitimate, which is to say illegitimate, than nuclear weapons anywhere in the world. It is a more emotional subject for a lot of folks, but a nuclear weapon's a nuclear weapon as far as I'm concerned.
To say,
Joe?
yeah, would you like to say something about that also, Elaine?
Oh, I would just say that a book that is very good, and perhaps you've already read it, on Israel, and Jim can correct me about the author's name. I think it's Avram Cohen, Israel and the Bomb.
Abner
Cohen, Israel and the Bomb, which is a fascinating study and shows that even the United States was, I don't want to say duped, I can't think of a nicer
You can say
word.
duped. Duped works.
Duped and misled by
Well, willingly
Israel.
duped,
Yeah.
I guess. It's more willingly and less willingly duped, depending on who it was.
But it's a very well written book. And you know, I must say that at times when I've been lecturing on nuclear weapons, and I'm always talking about our nuclear weapons, the United States, because I think that whatever country you're from, if your country has them, your first obligation is to address those and get rid of them. But sometimes I've gotten, you know, ferocious anger from people, and then it'll turn out that they're talking about Israel. They think that I'm trying to take away Israel's nuclear weapons. And I agree that it should be a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. But my work, my moral obligation is to U.S. nuclear weapons. But the passions run very strong on this subject. I've even had young students tell me that it was nuclear weapons that ended the war with Hitler. And I have to say, could you just check the chronology on that? Yeah. So.
I want to say one more thing about the nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. There have been countries who do want to talk about it as well, and they tried hard to get the meeting last couple of years ago, and actually that was coming out of the last non-proliferation treaty conference in 2010. That was the agenda for the group, and the U.S. and Russia, I think, and Britain, U.S., Russia, and Britain were supposed to organize something. Actually, we have an authority on that, and actually, I would be happy to give him a chance to talk a little bit about the upcoming non-proliferation treaty review. But what happened was the countries that did not, that were supposed to organize it, actually decided it was not a good idea because certain people weren't ready to talk about it, particularly Israel. But so the meeting did not happen in Helsinki that was supposed to happen, and we're still kind of in limbo about that. There have been certain other routes that people have taken, but one of the things that I would like Joseph Gerson to, who is working on he's one of the chairs of the work that I mentioned earlier, coming up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty this May, actions in April. He could tell us a little bit about them. Do you have the other mic that you could give to Joseph? And we'll take more questions. I just thought since you mentioned that, and I think it's an important
just to begin to say that, you know, as you pointed out, the Middle East Nuclear Weapons and WMDZ Free Zone conference was supposed to have been held in 2012, and the reason it wasn't held was the United States, which was to be a co-convener, didn't co-convene, and that has placed the NPT in further jeopardy. That's a central commitment coming from 1995, but reinforced in 2010. It's a very serious piece there. I guess the other piece I just wanted to say before talking about the review conference, just in terms of kind of bringing us up to date a little bit more, just to appreciate what was a week ago, that in the New York Times front page story, the United States planning to spend $1 trillion in the coming years, both for the modernization of its weapons, of its nuclear warheads, but also the delivery systems. And the reality is that every other nuclear power is in the process of modernization too. So to understand the current moment is very frightening. Also to appreciate that in the first days of the Ukraine crisis, both the United States and Russia engaged in nuclear weapons drills. Kind of, if you will, posturing, but the danger of miscalculation is always there. And to remember that the United States also conducted simulated nuclear weapons attacks against North Korea. So, you know, the problem isn't just, you know, that ugly Mr. Putin. So in terms of what we're doing, one thing that I think is very important, I want to encourage people here to find their way into it. one of the key elements of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is that every 5 years there's a review conference. And this provides an opportunity for the world's nations to hold one another accountable to their commitments. And the next one is coming up in 2015, next April and May. I was at the high-level meeting on disarmament at the UN last September, and it's really quite remarkable to see in that context just how isolated the nuclear weapons states are. Country after country actually rose to associate with President Rouhani's keynote speech, both on behalf of Iran but also the non-aligned movement. And so at this point we are about, and when we did in 2010, we had an international conference of 1,000 people, half of them from other countries, a march from Times Square to the United Nations with about 15,000 people. We were a little bit surprised to find as we were setting up our platform that a few hours earlier there'd been a failed terrorist attack there. And about almost 2,000 Japanese came with 7 million petition signatures to deliver on the floor of the General Assembly, which was done. So we're in the process of building in this way as well. I mean, in 2010, Ban Ki-moon spoke at our conference, and there was really quite a remarkable dynamic that I think reinforced the commitments of a number of people in the UN to have a successful conference. The reality is that we now have about, 7, 8 months between now and then. Elaine was talking about how do we wake up the US people. We are now at something like about 40 organizations in the United States and internationally who are building toward it. We're going to need to do a number of actions between now and then. It provides us an opportunity. I mean, the reality is we don't expect a miracle. We don't expect manna to fall from heaven next April and May. But it provides us an opportunity to put pressure that the NPT doesn't fall apart, that we put pressure on the nuclear powers to at least take some steps to implement their Article 6 obligations, and we build international movement to maintain the pressure for the longer term. So I would, we're organizing at student levels, we're organizing international labor, we're organizing it in faith communities, and I would just encourage people here to find ways to connect with us so we can, if you will, kind of help empower you to take the steps that need to be taken. Thank you.
So please sign up as this goes around, the clipboard goes around, and help us to build from the people you know who are hopefully different than all the people that we know.
Also, just say there's copies of the call that was released on Friday on the back table there. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Joseph. I'd like to take the gentleman up in the back. Can you run over and get the... Thank you very much. It's not the most efficient system, but we'll...
Hi, Tim Cargan, affiliated with Veterans for Peace and the Catholic worker community. I have two issues that I'm interested in hearing you speak about. One is that the retired head of the Israeli military and intelligence agencies, respectively, has said, I believe it was in the New York Review of Books, that the only way, like physically, that we could actually shut down the Iranian nuclear project would be to send troops down physically into the tunnels under, like we don't have the technology to bomb through a mountain and knock out their centrifuges. So the only possible way we could deal with that was with troops. And that, talk about like things that people aren't discussing. That seems like a relevant thing for people to discuss. And semi-related in terms of pressure to invade Iran is the fact that I believe I read Saudi Arabia is exempt from nuclear inspections. And I was really shocked when I read that, and it makes me curious why, especially when they seem to consider Iran like an existential threat to them. It makes me curious why they wouldn't want to be inspected for nuclear programs. So, yeah, if you could speak to those.
Jim?
Yeah, so let me focus on the first question. On the second question, I assume that, I'd have to check, but I assume Saudi Arabia participates in safeguards arrangements for whatever limited facilities they have. I'd be surprised if that wasn't the case. I don't think they've signed the additional protocol. I'd have to guess that, but I assume they have some safeguards in place. But on the first issue, the issue of retired Israeli military and intelligence officials saying that they don't have the capability to get at the, I think you're referring to the Fordo underground facility near Qom. And I think that is the view of most military analysts, that Israel doesn't have the capability to bomb that facility in a way to assure its destruction. The U.S. does, because it has a special earth-penetrating weapon that does this, the MOP. But I think it gets at a larger thing, and what you've seen in Israel is some discussion that is actually more diverse than you see in terms of the representation of Israel's views here. I mean, what we get here is a Netanyahu line, and that's one important voice and probably a majority voice on national security, but it's far from the only voice. And you saw several retired intelligence military officials, even currently serving, come out about a year ago and say, wait a minute, this Rouhani thing may be more than a smiling face, and this might represent some sort of authentic possibility for Iran's future, and that let's not discount a nuclear deal right off the bat. Again, it's a more diverse view than we commonly hear about there. It's not tremendously diverse, but it is more diverse than we hear. I would say, just backing up, and so what is the thing that you said is, and I think it's true, even if we bombed with Qom, with earth-penetrating weapons, the reality is that no. If you were intent on ensuring a 0% chance that Iran would never get a nuclear weapon, you would have to invade and occupy it. They know how to build a centrifuge. The DNI says they have a basic nuclear capability. Why? Because they know how to build a centrifuge and they have the tradecraft associated with it. They've done it 20,000 times. So bombing that, I was part of a report on the costs and benefits of military action against Iran that was signed by a whole host of foreign policy luminaries, Republican and Democratic advisors to, national security advisors to presidents, blah, 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 blah. And our estimate was a military attack by Israel would set back Iran's program 2 years. An attack by the U.S. would probably be 4 years. And my own view is once you do that, you guarantee the very result you're trying to avoid. So the DNI says they've not yet made a nuclear weapons decision. Knowing Iran as I do, my guess would be is if you bomb them, they would wake up the next day and say, screw you, we're going to build a bomb. And to me, in my scholarship, the most important variable for explaining nuclear outcomes is political will. So they know how to build it. So the question is, what are they going to do with that knowledge? Are you going to put it on a track where, like the other 30 countries, they end up not being a nuclear weapon state, or do you take actions, and I think military action is one of them, it's likely to produce the very thing you say you're trying to avoid?
I kind of think that this gentleman right here.
Thank you both for coming tonight. This is a really great talk. I have a question for both of you. If Iran was to get the bomb and it would successfully deter an invasion from the United States or another aggressive country, would it be justified?
I'll take that first. This is a simple one for me. First of all, Iran is a party to the NPT. I think all NPT states should live up to their obligations, right? So Iran's obligation under the NPT is that it not pursue or acquire nuclear weapons. And the weapon states' obligations under the NPT are that it forsakes its nuclear weapons, that all the weapon states give up their nuclear weapons. I see no reason why that's not, I don't think, I'm good with that. I think the states that don't have nuclear weapons in the NPT shouldn't have them, and the ones that do, that are in the NPT, are legally obliged by Article 6 to give up the ones that they have. And I'm willing to stick with that.
Well, and I would say that they're never justified to use them. But we have to think about, just as it was not legitimate for them to use them, so we have to think about our own near use of them, as I was chronicling. And as Joe Gearson points out, we often use them in the sense that we threaten. In fact, even during some of the Iran negotiations, President Obama has said, everything's on the table, right? He's used the expression, everything's on the table. How is Iran supposed to understand that? Aren't they supposed to understand it as the possibility that the US would use nuclear weapons? The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review was presented to us as though it had a lot of great improvements. And the major improvement was that we were pledging that we would not use a nuclear weapon against a country that did not have a nuclear weapon and was a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it said, we can't promise that we'll hold on to that pledge. So you would think that it was never on the table that we would use a nuclear weapon against a country that didn't have a nuclear weapon and that was a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it was considered a step forward in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review that that provision was made. So we have a very long way to go.
But I mean, just in terms of deterrence for a military invasion, not for using it against the United States or another country, but just as a deterrence for military invasion.
There are lots of countries that have problems with their neighbors that seek to deter aggression. They don't all own nuclear weapons, so I don't know why that would apply in this case. You know, and if you talk to the Iranians themselves, they say that they don't want nuclear weapons. And I think they did have a program between 1998 and 2003, by the way. But they say they don't want nuclear weapons, and they say wisely that if they got nuclear weapons, that would cause them other problems in the region. It might cause Saudi Arabia or others to reevaluate their options. And the reality is they have, as I said, they have a basic capabilities, right? I mean, they can build a centrifuge. So if push came to shove and something really where they felt like they had to build one, they probably would. But, you know, international politics is about creating these paths where those scenarios begin to vanish in, you know, in terms of likelihood. Of course, there are things that are possible, but what you want is to put people on a pathway that has momentum. So I think if we get an Iran nuclear deal, I think even though it's theoretically possible in some future state far away in the future, they might revisit that option. But the political reality is no. I think that is a thing that would work. And I would say, by the way, in reference to the WMD-free zone in the Middle East, which the UN RevCom is in May, you know, that WMD-free zone isn't going anywhere if this negotiation falls apart. And that's determined in the next 2 months. So I think that's where the priority ought to be. That's just my personal opinion. Everyone should work on things they're interested in and let 100 flowers bloom and all that. I get that. But in terms of the calendar, that's sort of the most important, biggest opportunity there is that we've had in 30 years that we're likely to have for a long, long time, and that's happening now.
And what would you do tomorrow morning or next week with that in mind? You know, I actually think for mass peace action and for some of the local groups, the answer is surprising and it's small. And here's the deal. I know Ed Markey. I've known him for years. He's been a leader in nuclear stuff for a long, long time. But he has wavered on sort of how to handle Iran in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so I think it would behoove his friends and supporters to reach out to him now and begin to communicate how important this is. Okay. So there isn't confusion on his part later on. Thank you, and you will too, I'm sure. Marina.
Hi, yes, I'm Marina again. So I have a question in regards to the Iran negotiations, and specifically it's more, I understand the excitement about Rouhani and the new, breath of fresh air that he is coming from Ahmadinejad, but there is this consistent variable with the supreme leader, right, who's been there for quite a long time from the duration of the first program until now. So what is his stance? Where does he stand in this whole process?
I think it's a great question. So let's step back and say, how does the Iranian system work? The Iranian system is one of decentralized power. There are lots of institutions that have power. The most important player is the supreme leader, but it's not like he's out there managing everything every day. You know, do this, do that, do this, do that. He is more the decider. And so what he can do is say, stop doing this, or give a green light to something. And often what he does is sit back and let other parts of the Iranian government sort of battle it out, and then he comes in at the end. So the supreme leader is the first and most important decider, but not a day-to-day manager. The president's important. Their Congress is sort of important, what they call the modulus. And then they have an assembly of experts and another institution. But they all, there's a lot of, even though Iran's controlled by an elite, there's a lot of factionalization, a lot of infighting, a lot of pushing back and forth. As relates to the nuclear file, the supreme leader has given it to the president and the foreign minister, and has repeatedly come out in public and said that he supports his negotiating team. So if we get an agreement, I think he'll accept it. And I think why that is true in part is because of the election. Rouhani was elected in a giant shocker. No one thought Rouhani was going to be elected. I certainly didn't. No one I know did, inside Iran or outside Iran. We thought he might make a runoff and then lose, but not that he would win on the first ballot outright with 50% of the vote. But he won with 50% of the vote. That means 49% of the people voted against him. So he has a need to be able to deliver on this issue. And if he does, the supreme leader will support him. But if he isn't able to deliver, I think Rouhani will be much weakened. The supreme leader will stop holding the critics at bay, which he's doing right now. And the supreme leader's attitude will be, I told you so. You know, because I think the supreme leader, even though I haven't met him, and he's not someone a lot of people have met, but the rap, right or wrong, on him is that he's deeply conservative. I mean, conservative with a small c. He thinks the U.S. is out to get them. And he thinks that because it's all about regime change, over the years, people, Hatami and others, have come to him and say, I can make a deal with the U.S. And he says to them, I don't believe it, but you're free to try. Go and do the best you can. But if you fail, don't come crying to me, I told you so. And so far, that's what's happened every time. You know, it hasn't worked out. They've come back to him and he says, I told you so. So the question now is it going to be, I told you so, and a spiral downward? Or are we going to get an agreement that he, so far, has provided political cover for?
Well, thank you very, very much for your presentations. I think they are very illuminating. Forgive my naivety, but when I hear nuclear, it terrifies me, whether it is weapons or energy. Could you clarify that kind of fear that I have? Could you give me some kind of explanations for me to understand how dangerous? Obviously, anyone knows that weapons are more dangerous. But what about nuclear energy? Is that safer?
I'll take I'm sure, Elaine, you'll have things to say about this. I want to say, I think the question you raise is so important, and maybe not even for reasons you've suspected. I'm not going to get into a whole nuclear energy thing right now. I think people disagree. All forms of energy have costs, and people will weigh those costs differently. Coal is a pretty dirty source of energy, and climate change is important. Nuclear, long-term waste disposal, you know, other sorts of issues, sort of fragility, you know, one accident and the whole system shuts down. And it only produces, you know, some electricity. It's not going to, the trend lines are nuclear isn't going to disappear tomorrow, and it isn't going to revolutionize everything tomorrow. It's sort of here to stay, at a lower level for a while. And people will debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But the thing that I am inspired by in your question is this question of fear. And you are absolutely right. And it's been true from the dawn of the nuclear age that whether it's energy or weapons, anything involving radiation has something that seizes the heart and brain and produces fear. And what I tried to do in my talk, and I know that all of us are here, there's a selection bias here. You're not a random group. You're a group here because you're concerned about nuclear things. And so let me speak to you, as a friend and a member of that group. Our tendency is to try to scare people to death. I'm not sure that's a good way to persuade people to action. I think it persuades some people to action, but I think there's some good psychological studies that for a lot of other people, it just makes them freeze up. And so I think you have to give a reason for people to want to act, and so part of that is the danger you face. But part of that is that there's a possibility of success, that your action will not be in vain, that there's a reason to do this. And so that's why when I give my talks, I also talk about we've been shockingly successful. Everyone thought we were going to blow ourselves up. Everyone thought we were going to have 4 dozen nuclear weapon states. It didn't happen. So this is not some naive, faraway vision that's impossible. Those predictions did not come true. And so the question before us is recognizing success, building on success, and moving it forward. And I think partly the way you do that is, as activist people can play the fear card, but then you've got to pull people back in and say, it's not all scary. This is one of the great achievements of humankind, that we haven't blown ourselves up and that we've done things that have never been done before. The NPT is unbelievable. It's a little piece of paper. It's a little piece of paper. It doesn't even have an enforcement clause. And yet it has had a miraculous effect on governments deciding whether to become nuclear weapon states or not. So I think it's important to recognize that this stuff does bring fear, but we need to give people a path out of fear towards something that they can act on.
Wow, Elaine, you must have something to say.
A lot of the statements Jim made I agree with, like the complication of many forms of energy. I'm actually from a coal mining family, so I know the terrible costs all around there. Germany, we know, is in the lead in really trying to show how people can be independent of both oil and nuclear, and is having remarkable success, it seems. So there's reason to be optimistic. It does seem to me, though the nuclear reactors for energy are frightening, as you said, there's really no comparison. They don't exist in order to, their mission isn't to destroy cities, though they may, in fact, destroy cities. I mean, we've seen with the recent thing. The one thing I really disagree with Jim about, I just want to say it, is I think it's actually spiritually and morally wrong to use language like the fear card and so forth. I think that if you go to a time where there's an apparatus for injury, let's say the concentration camps, and this is an arrangement, this is a death camp writ large. Mm-hmm. It is writ very large. It's writ many more than 6 million large, okay? And to imagine saying, if somebody wanted to speak out in Germany, you're playing the fear card. I would really, we have different points of view, but I just think that that's wrong. And it isn't that people should feel afraid, but they should feel empowered, and they should know that it's not just up to what Obama or Kissinger or McNamara or the negotiators say. The population stands to be injured. In the social contract, everybody is equal. The right of the Swiss have a term, equality of survival. everybody should have an equal chance to survive. And what nuclear weapons have done is completely eliminate equality of survival, so that what an ordinary citizen says is trivial. It's just making flowers bloom. It's nothing. No, that's wrong, because it's by citizens understanding that just as their lives are as important as the negotiators' lives or the powerful people's lives, so their responsibility is there too. Just as we blame people in countries in the past that didn't speak out against moral harms.
Yeah, this is Guntram Mueller from Mass Peace Action. And I have a question for Jim Walsh. I'm wondering what makes you so optimistic that the Iran negotiations will work out. And the reason I'm asking this is because I read in the paper that the American position was they're trying to get Iran to have 1,500 centrifuges, and apparently they've agreed to elevate that to 2,500. You say now they have about 19,000, and I recall Ayatollah Khamenei saying that he wants 10 times the current level. So how do you go from 2,500 to well, 190,000, I guess?
Yeah. Well, it is confusing, all these numbers thrown around. I would say, first of all, I've been optimistic about the nature of the negotiations because this is the first time in decades where the political incentive structure aligned up for both countries. So Rouhani, and he said it in the events with me last week, they want a nuclear deal sooner rather than later. Because Rouhani won on, for lack of a better phrase, won an election based on hope and change. And he needs to be able to return to his domestic constituency and say, look, I've delivered, I've produced. And he needs a nuclear agreement to do that. So Iran has a strong political incentive to try to get something done if it's doable. And the U.S. has a political incentive to do it because this is a chance to constrain that program rather than let it go unconstrained. So I've been an optimist all along. I think the Joint Plan of Action, the interim agreement, has worked fabulously well. And as I said in my slide, I went through all the issues, the tough issues that they've managed to make progress on. Some of them very important. But there is this last issue of the size and contours of the enrichment program. And 1,500 centrifuges is a ridiculous number that Iran is never going to agree to. It's just not going to happen. And if we insist on that number, or 2,500, then we'll kill the negotiations. So I'm hopeful that creative diplomats can find creative ways to get around some of these, because it's really not about the numbers. It really isn't. I mean, as I said, we have on the table now a doable agreement. This is about the politics, not the numbers, or the politics of the numbers. So I think the president is going to have to intervene at some point and say, no, this is acceptable. We can accept 7,000 or whatever it's going to be. And frankly, 10 years from now or 20 years from now, I will bet everyone in this room $10 that 10 years from now, whether this agreement succeeds or doesn't succeed won't be the difference between 5,000 centrifuges and 5,001 centrifuges. That's not what determines whether an agreement is successful or not. And so I think this is all silly, and that's why I think it would be such a horrible, disastrous move to throw away something we've gotten so close to. And I'm still an optimist because I believe that when the decision makers peer over the edge and they look at what that world looks like when those negotiations collapse, that will focus their minds. And they'll say, this is a better alternative than what we're looking at over that edge, and that we will get an agreement. But I will either be wrong or right in 2 months.
Elaine, did you
Thank you.
comment on this, or shall I go with the next? Ross, why don't you just...
Okay. This has been a very interesting evening, and I do appreciate the some handle to more optimism, Mr. Walsh, which you gave, and I'm hoping that your slides are maybe available
Sure.
as in printout. But One thing has constantly troubled me, and I don't see it addressed at all in the public conversation about Iran. And you've been there, so you may be able to answer. There's such an imbalance in the power. And I'm wondering, are there no sentiments, either among the public or some of the Iran factions, the hardliners or whatever, for national pride and for, I mean, here the US has sort of arrogated to itself the ability just to, from their point of view, almost decide who can have nuclear weapons and who can't. We have not made this kind of a fuss about Israel, about Pakistan, about India, but you know, everything is pointed to this country we've loved to demonize ever since 1979, but where, you know, doesn't that dynamic get involved in this in some way?
That's a great question, and there, I want to speak to both pieces of it that are buried together in one really good question. First is national pride. Yes, the Iranians have national pride. This is a big driver for a lot of their behavior. I can use it with this audience. I can't use it with student audiences, but you all will relate to this. Iran is the Rodney Dangerfield of Southwest Asia. They feel like they don't get any respect. These are broad cultural generalizations that should not be taken too far, but they're Persians, they're not Arabs, they're not Turks, they're Persians. They look back to a glorious, you know, time of Cyrus and their great achievements. When you go into an Iranian office, there's a map of the region on the wall, and what's in the center of that map? It's Iran. They believe, like the U.S. believes, in manifest destiny. They have a special place in the world that God has ordained, just like we believe the same thing. I mean, there are some countries for whom national pride, you know, the U.S., France, India, Iran, pride is a big deal. And so it's not the only factor, but it is a factor.
Would they get more respect if they had nuclear weapons?
You know, I don't know. Does North Korea have more respect? I don't think so. You know, I think that's fool's gold. I think that the other part in your question is the differentiation in power status. You know, as a political scientist, that appeals to me as a concept. And you're right, and it's so completely ignored. And Iranians come and say to me, and it matters now, about that point matters right now, because we're at a negotiating table between unequal bargainers. And so who has bigger stakes in this? You know, I think Iran has bigger stakes in it than we do, frankly, right? Because they're the ones who will get bombed. No one's bombing the U.S. if the negotiations fail. Someone's going to bomb them. And everyone's pointing at them. Their stakes are much higher. They have a lot more skin in the game than we do. And we're all, you know, we have the biggest military, I don't have to tell this crowd all that. And so they say to me, well, we've arrived at an impasse. Shouldn't the more powerful country be who has less at stake, be the one who can make the compromise to get this done? It seems to me that's not an unreasonable question.
Elaine, did you have something you wanted to say? Anybody?
Yes, my name's Elaine Scarry, Mass Peace Action. This has been very enlightening. Thank you, everybody, particularly. Two questions for clarifications, mainly from Professor Scarry. You mentioned that the U.S. has more power, nuclear power, yet in numbers, I believe Russia has more nuclear bombs. I just was hoping for clarification on that one. The second is just of interest in another kind of way. You mentioned that Switzerland has a genius-level fallout center. I'm dying to hear more about that.
The fallout shelter in Switzerland, yeah. So the second is the one I'll take first. Switzerland, back in the 70s, decided that they were tired of petitioning Russia and the United States to stop talking about sending nuclear weapons over their head, and that they didn't want to be permanently in the position of servitude, the kind of please posture. So that in order to become independent, they had to reduce the possibility that their population could be injured. So they have a requirement in Switzerland that every house has to have a fallout shelter beneath it, and the fallout shelter has many requirements to pass muster. Or if you don't, you have to contribute a certain amount of money to the public fallout shelter. In the 21st century, they had a referendum in which 80% of the population turned out and voted, or maybe it's 80% voted in favor of keeping that requirement. They have enough fallout shelters for 114% of everyone who resides there. Inside many mountains are hospitals. I say, following a Swiss friend of mine, it's a reverse Potemkin village. A Potemkin village is a facade with nothing underneath. Switzerland, you don't see the structures, but under every house is a fallout shelter, and in many mountains are hospitals, and in fact, in many mountains are airports for military planes. And you know that, and this is a kind of right to bear arms argument, the Swiss have this requirement for military service for men, and yet they're committed to neutrality and to peace. But in their scientific research, and ordinarily the Swiss, as with the Swiss pharmaceutical companies, is considered very wise about their medical research. Their medical research says that if you're directly hit by a nuclear weapon, nothing will protect you. But if you're even just 5 miles away, and you have this fallout system, fallout shelter system, you will survive. And not only do they have it for all their residents, citizens and residents, but they have the arrangements for all their cultural property. So that if you are Swiss and a male, again for female it's voluntary, you have a certain number of days, civil service days a year, where you're assigned a specific thing. For example, one friend of mine is assigned going to a certain church in Zurich, taking all the statues, wrapping them, taking them to a shelter. At the end of the drill, he has to get them, bring them back, dust them off. And they have tremendous plans. They have to find out, is there a staircase that's too narrow to accommodate this painting or this statue, whatever. And it is, this is something that can be perceived in either way. Lots of times people, it's the famous sentence from the Orson Welles' Third Man movie, what did Switzerland invent? The cuckoo clock. Or you can see it as I see it, as a great act of civil genius, because they have actually defended their population. In our country, we've spent the same amount of money on fallout shelters, but it's on the presidential fallout shelter in Mount Weather. That is the size of a small city. It's got water and 3-story buildings and so forth. We've got billions of dollars spent on airborne shelters for the president. They also had one for Congress, and then Congress said they wouldn't use it when the citizenry was unprotected. But more money is spent on the presidential fallout shelter than, not just then on fallout shelters for the population of the United States. The population of this country decided that you couldn't protect anyone with fallout shelters, and it would only increase the chances of going to war. Well, what increases the chances of going to war is to make sure that the person who has the nuclear arsenal at his fingertips has the fallout shelter and the citizenry doesn't. But the point I was getting to is more is spent on the presidential fallout shelter than on all forms of civil defense in the United States for hurricanes, floods, landslides, etc. It's roughly, it's calculated as about 50 cents per person. On 9/11, we saw that our military, despite its extravagant expenditures, could not even protect the Pentagon. And I don't mean to make light of them, but they are not practiced in defending the country. They are practiced in kind of international aggression. The citizens on Flight 93 protected the country. The Pentagon, though they had much larger lead time, they had, depending on how you count it, between 55 minutes and about 40 minutes lead time, could not defend their own headquarters. And that just goes to the point that it hasn't been designed around protecting the country. The Swiss system actually is built around equality of survival for all its citizens. And question one, I have a feeling that Jim probably has a very technical answer to that. I don't think he would want to argue that Russia has a more powerful arsenal, would you?
They have more nuclear weapons.
Of course they have more nuclear weapons, but do you?
You know, the chart showed that they had more nuclear weapons. You know, you and I somewhat disagree. I mean, we're coming at it from different things. Your whole thing is the U.S., and I get that, and I support that. But in my view, a myopic focus on U.S. behavior is not helpful because it lets all the other states off the hook, right? So Russia has done a lot more to move negatively on nuclear weapons than the U.S. has. I mean, you're upset that and rightly so, that the nuclear posture review did not go as far as it might have gone. The Russian nuclear military doctrine has gone in the opposite direction, making nuclear weapons a more central part of their military doctrine. So I think the U.S. everyone here, as you all have done and hopefully will continue to do, will press for advances here in the U.S. On the nuclear issue. But at some point, you know, the other states can't continue to get a pass. And so when we have an NPT review conference, is China held up? No, it's not. Is Russia held up? No, it's not. So when we say the weapon states, we mean all the weapon states. And so the U.S. has offered to go down another 500. Let's have a taker. Let's have someone say yes to that, who's a weapon state. But we're fast approaching our time here.
Yeah, we need to close. So I want to recognize, you probably have something you want to add to that, Joseph. And I don't like to cut someone else off who's spoken already. If you can hold it, come up here and talk to us afterwards, okay?
So if you put two sides of the same coin, one, all of the countries have to be held accountable. It's fully agreed. Right. The other then is to look from Russia's perspective with the expansion of NATO to its borders, with the missile defenses, with U.S. overwhelming dominance in conventional and high-tech weapons. So it's understandable, given the history of the Napoleonic invasion, the Kaiser and Hitler, that the weaker state would draw on its ultimate weapon, which is to say its use is intolerable. They all have to be held accountable. But that does point back to the United States and its policies as a central problem.
I want to thank you all. I want to thank our wonderful panel. Thank you so much, Elaine and Jim. And I want you all to take very seriously the urgency that Jim put into our next 2 months. It's not even 2 months. We have got to make a real effort to reach anyone who we think is important, particularly Markey, I agree, is very important. So if everyone in this room wrote him a letter, it would not hurt. It would be a big help. And
actually, often that's not the case, and it's the same old, you're told that all the time. I actually think this would matter in this particular case, because Markey thinks of himself as one of us, right?
Exactly.
He thinks of himself. And so the fact that he's sort of out here in this other space, I think, ironically, he is someone that you could have the most impact on.
Right. Many of you know that he was one of the people who stood up for the freeze and has been a strong exponent of nuclear nonproliferation.
Yes.
So we just have to remind him. Remember how much he cared about Randy Forsberg, for one thing.
I very much
Thank you very much.